Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And these are going to be exciting minutes. Every show we do, we aim to be educational and informative and entertaining. And I think we'll probably accomplish most of that tonight, but you be the judge. Thanks to you, this is our 134th TNT Show. In other words, we've been running for almost 3 years, almost continuously with a few breaks at Christmas and New Year. And Indie Live is growing and delivering more exciting shows in addition to the TNT Show. And you can watch the TNT Show, for example, on indielive.net, which is streamed out to YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus, if you're of a mind, you can look at any of our previous 133 shows on YouTube at your leisure. You know something? If you're upset by media coverage of political events, where journalism is often junked in favor of stenography or just rehashed news releases, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found it. We're here for you. And now's your chance to hear for us. Please support the crowdfunder when you'll see the details on the screen. It's been another great day for British democracy. The government has confirmed today that it will use barges to house immigrants and others. Shades of prison hulks. If you don't know, prison hulks were decommissioned ships that the authorities used as floating prisons in the 18th and 19th centuries in England. The term prison hulk is not synonymous with the related term of convict ship. A hulk is a ship that's afloat, but completely incapable of going to sea, whereas, of course, convict ships are seaworthy to a degree to transport convicted felons, i.e. people who stole a handkerchief, perhaps, to their place of conviction and to their banishment. So in many respects, we've gone back to the future with a vengeance. Tonight, we'll be talking about a British Constitution, human rights, women's rights, immigration, politics, democracy, and perhaps we can touch upon independence. And we'll be talking about all of these things with a distinguished academic, Dr. Daniela Nadj of St. Mary's University. And she will be taking your questions live. So there's still time to get your thoughts or comments considered. You'll see the details on the screen. Well, as you know, the TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now to our guest tonight. Daniela, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yes, I mean, we've got so much to talk about, but I think first and foremost, we should just mention to people, and perhaps Kevin could put up the graphic, that you're the author of International Criminal Law and Sexual Violence Against Women. There it's on the screen now. Where can people get a copy of the book, do you think, Daniela?
They can buy it on Amazon, or I think Waterstones online also has copies of the book, and probably other bookstores, but Amazon is a good source for that. Mm-hmm.
What's been the reaction to your book?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty positive. I mean, it's quite an academic book, so it involves a lot of research on international criminal law and human rights law and humanitarian law. So it's a book that, hopefully appeals to students, to academics, to people who are interested in international law and international criminal tribunals, maybe to people who study politics as well. So yeah, I hope that it's informative and educational and interesting.
It says here in the blurb that, excuse me, you're focusing on International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda.
Correct, yeah.
I mean, the British government plans to send people to Rwanda.
Mm-hmm,
Is that
yes.
legal, do you think?
Well, technically speaking, no, I would say. I mean, it's subject to litigation now. The government is obviously determined to send people to Rwanda. We should stress these are asylum seekers that it wants to send to Rwanda. They have won the initial case at first instance in the High Court, but the claimants, so the asylum seekers and their lawyers, have appealed it. And so the Court of Appeal will rule at the end of April whether that policy is legal or not, so whether it breaches international human rights conventions or not. The problem with the policy is that I think it could potentially be in breach of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which prohibits inhuman and degrading treatment of people and torture, because if it's found that there's a real risk that people might get tortured in Rwanda or might get treated cruelly and in a degrading fashion, then the UK won't be able to send them to Rwanda. And there's also jurisprudence at the European Court of Human Rights, so case law which confirms that. So no state that is a member of the Council of Europe can send people to a state where they might face torture or cruel and degrading treatment. So I think that's the problem for the UK government.
But the UK government has often suggested that it is free of all these international bodies exercising control over it. Is that
no, it's not. No, it's not. So Brexit had nothing to do with the European Court of Human Rights. The UK is still bound by the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a separate international human rights treaty. And that also means that it has to follow the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Under Section 2 of the Human Rights Act, our domestic courts in the UK need to interpret domestic law in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. So they need to look to Strasbourg to interpret domestic law. And they will very often follow the case law produced by the European Court of Human Rights.
I mean, I hesitate to ask this question because, I mean, it's the obvious one, but it may be a complicated answer. And if it is, maybe you could shrink it to the layman's term, perhaps. What would happen if a British court ruled in favour of the government, but the European court decided otherwise?
Well, that's to a certain extent, that's what already happened, because the High Court ruled in favor of the government when it came to the Rwanda policy. But so the reason why no people have been sent to Rwanda is because the European Court of Human Rights put an injunction against it. So it said nobody can be sent to Rwanda unless the policy is determined to be legal in terms of its compliance with international human rights obligations. So that's why we need to wait for the Court of Appeal decision at the end of April to see whether the policy is indeed legal or not, or whether it breaches international human rights law. So until that point, the government can't do anything because they have to follow the injunction made by the European Court of Human Rights.
So right now, the UK government is abiding by a judgment by the European Court of Human Rights.
So it's not. Sorry. Yeah.
No, go right ahead.
So it's not strictly speaking a judgment that it's abiding by. It's an injunction, which means that the European Court of Human Rights can prevent the UK government from sending asylum seekers to Rwanda at the moment. So it basically put a stop to it until the policy is heard in the courts and the courts rule whether it's legal or not to send people to Rwanda.
So what sanctions, if any, are available to the European Court of Human Rights?
Well, so if the UK were not to comply with decisions by the European Court of Human Rights, then the UK would have to pay a fine at some stage for non-compliance with decisions by the European Court of Human Rights. But as I said previously, the UK tends to follow the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. And interestingly enough, also domestically, so our judges have the power under the Human Rights Act to interpret domestic law in line with the European Convention on Human Rights, or to enter a declaration of incompatibility if domestic law doesn't comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. And that basically means that Parliament has to redraft the legislation, or the government needs to make changes. And in most cases, the government follows what the courts are doing, what the courts have told Parliament to do, essentially. So, you know, that's maybe something that isn't mentioned so often in the media, but there is, generally speaking, quite a strong compliance with decisions by the court when it comes to human rights.
Yeah, a lot of people would worry that when they look at the situation in Northern Ireland, for example, and the way the British government has behaved there, that there's a sense among some people that the UK is only complying with the Good Friday Agreement because of pressure from the US. but would willingly breach it if they were given the freedom to do so.
Well, I think it's more than that. I think, I mean, part of the deal with the European Union when the UK negotiated the withdrawal agreement was to, of course, keep the Good Friday Agreement intact, but the EU also said to the UK, you must also stay in the European Convention on Human Rights. So I mean, if you want a good deal with us, essentially, you need, number one, you need to stay in the European Convention on Human Rights, which the EU is also bound by. And number two, you need to respect the Good Friday Agreement. So the two are tied together. And I think that's something that very often isn't mentioned in the media either. So that, you know, if the UK were to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, that might put the Good Friday Agreement in jeopardy as well. And I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah. How do you think, you don't need to answer this question if you feel that it's not within your bailiwick or competence, but how do you think people outside the UK view the behaviour of the UK post-Brexit?
I think with great concern. I mean, I can speak a little bit about the German perspective because I travel to Germany frequently and I'm a native speaker, so I read the papers there as well. I think with great concern. I think there's kind of, almost a lack of understanding why the UK government is acting in the way it is and why it's being so antagonistic towards international human rights obligations. And I think just diplomacy in general. So I think I think there's a lot of puzzlement by the behavior of the British government, certainly when it comes to international human rights law. I think the EU and Germany, I know, is very concerned about the Rwanda policy.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it would be, and they're not alone, I suspect. When we promoted the show tonight, Europeans is the one that's generated an interesting bunch of responses ahead of time, because, as you know, we invite questions during the show, and somebody has dropped us a note to say, could you ask her why she thinks Leave voters who enjoy holidaying in the 27, which I assume means the remaining members of the EU, are hypocrites, whilst she enjoys everything the UK, a non-member state, has to offer, yet spends her days slagging us off, but isn't? I'm not sure I fully understand. Maybe you understand that question better than I do. I've read it twice.
Well, first of all, I'm not slagging anybody off. For me, I think it's maybe a bit bewildering why perhaps people who have homes more in the EU or in EU countries or tend to travel a lot there and spend a lot of time there voted to leave. I find that maybe somewhat difficult or illogical to comprehend. But it's more that I think what I find a shame about maybe Brexit is that people have essentially lost their freedom of movement, so they can't really work in another EU state without needing a work permit, and you know, I think that's a shame. You know, I mean, that's essentially my point. So I think people who travel to the EU a lot or maybe have holiday homes, I would imagine, sort of feel more European, but maybe that's not the case.
Well, you know, it's a very odd situation, but it would seem that there are people who are very active Brexiteers who have a number of homes on continental Europe. And find it very convivial to travel back and forth to these homes. I think Boris Johnson's father is included in that number. And in fact, some of them have actually taken up French or Spanish nationality.
Exactly.
It seems very odd that you add to that the fact that hundreds of MPs now have Irish passports.
Correct.
And the only logic in having an Irish passport is somehow to rejoin the EU without actually being open and plain about it. We've had a quick question I want to ask you. Somebody has asked, Age of Aquarius, my understanding is that the EU is not bound by the ECHR, but the member states are.
No, the EU as an entity is bound by the ECHR. It's considered as a state in international law. So
Oh,
the
right.
EU is a state party to the European Convention on Human Rights.
Okay. So, so very, very interesting situation. So we've got a situation where the UK plans to lock up people in these barges, presumably prior to sending them to Rwanda. I mean, I assume these are holding areas.
Yes, I think in disused military air bases as well, and barges and old cruise ships, I believe.
Yeah, I'm using holding in preference to another word, which would be provocative, perhaps. And then these poor folks would be sent to Rwanda, which has, I imagine, a rather poor human rights record. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, I mean, so I have written about Rwanda in my book as well, because it looks at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. I mean, first of all, there was a genocide in Rwanda in 1994 where almost 1 million people died within 3 months. So, it is a post-conflict society. While it is stable now, I think it has a stable government. I think there are many human rights concerns. I think freedom of expression is not necessarily guaranteed there by the government. I think journalists have to be very careful. I think the conditions in these detention camps are not necessarily safe. So this is not a country that is a, let's say, fully fledged democracy that can, I think, offer a degree of protection that these people need and that can necessarily guarantee basic human rights.
And how safe is it externally? I mean, I gather it has trouble with its neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. There is, I think, potential conflict brewing with the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think it's very much at a post-conflict stage, and maybe even there is renewed political tension in Rwanda. So I don't think it's a safe country to be sending asylum seekers to.
So let me get this right. We could be sending children
yes.
to a war zone.
Well, it's not an official war zone, let's say.
No, of course not. But potentially, yes. War zone. And as we know,
yes, children with their parents. I mean, they wouldn't separate the children from their parents, but yes, children could be sent to Rwanda with their parents. Yes.
Yeah. So a family could end up in Rwanda.
Yes.
And Rwanda may experience a military situation with its neighbors. I mean, that just seems to be completely obscene.
Yes.
Why would you do such a thing? I mean, for example, if I suggested to you that these people who are on these prison hulks or barges are sent to Ukraine, you would say, well, that's outrageous, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, yes.
But that's essentially what we're saying here. I mean, these people could be sent to a Ukraine-type environment, perhaps, well, hopefully not. But if these two states are at daggers drawn, then you wouldn't want to send anyone into an environment like that with the risk that there could be military action.
Absolutely, yes. And also because of the additional human rights record. So Amnesty International, which is a very well-known NGO, published a report last year saying that there is, political persecution of people who have spoken out against the government. There are allegations of torture in prisons in Rwanda. So, this is not an environment where fundamental human rights are guaranteed.
And I guess when these people end up in Rwanda, they cease to be under British protection.
Yeah, I mean, they're essentially, they are still part of, or international law continues to apply to them. The International Refugee Convention continues to apply to them, and Rwanda is bound by that. But yes, it's essentially a Rwandan law that would then apply, and in addition to the International Refugee Convention, yes, but not British law, no.
Yeah. So these people might end up in a war zone being governed by a constitution which might not be in a position to recognize human rights and presumably could be changed at any time.
Yeah, there's an additional risk of that as well. I don't know what the current situation is in terms of the constitution in Rwanda, but yeah, I think the government has a lot of power there, and yes, they could potentially change the constitution as well. So, I mean, Rwanda is bound by international human rights treaties, so that's one layer of protection for people. But, you know, it's not the same as being in the UK or a state that is bound by the European Convention on Human Rights. No.
Yeah. And you mentioned too in your book that that there was, in terms of the Rwanda situation, that women suffered particularly.
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Conflict.
Yeah, Tutsi women were targeted for mass rapes, sexual violence. They were, you know, subject to a genocide, essentially. The Tutsi population of Rwanda was targeted, and many, many women were unfortunately raped, yeah, as part of the genocide. So I'm very concerned about the well-being of women as well who are sent to Rwanda.
Yeah, because it's women that take the brunt of situations like that, if the Ukraine and other places are any guide. Absolutely. So when you look at the situation in the UK just now, what's your sense, if you were to look, say, 2-3 years down the pike, as the Americans say, down the road, and you know, we were sitting here having this discussion, what do you think the UK is going to look like in 3 years' time?
Ooh, that's a difficult question. Well, can I say what I hope should happen, or
please, and then tell us what you think might happen.
Yeah, I think, well, my hope would be that we have a closer relationship with the European Union. I think that's a first step that is essential. I hope it gets much better than it is at the moment. Maybe with a potential return to the single market. I know that this is, at the moment, nobody's talking about it, and British politicians are very afraid to express it. I know it's different in Scotland. Scottish politicians are talking about it, but that would be my hopeful vision for the UK, maybe a return to the single market. In terms of Scotland, I'm not sure exactly what will happen. I mean, the SNP has a new leader. I understand he's pro-independence, so I don't know whether that will galvanize the pro-independence movement or not, but I understand that Scotland wants to be a member of the EU, so...
Well, Scotland voted not to leave, that's
exactly.
Significantly. I mean, it wasn't a sort of close-run thing.
Exactly.
The Scottish electorate were very plain that they wanted to stay in the EU. And I suspect a lot of the voting intentions are influenced by that view. There's a strong European aspiration here, and a sense of being cheated. Because when this decision came up, the Brexit referendum was being discussed in the House of Commons. A number of commitments were made that though that there didn't need to be separate votes in Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales, because their views would be respected before any political decisions were taken. Because, as we all know, a referendum is not conclusive. It's purely advisory in the UK.
Exactly, yes.
So then it was a political decision to press ahead with Brexit, and the form of Brexit was determined by politicians. Because the vote was very basic. It just said, leave or go. Which is pretty crude, I have to say. You know, when you think of a nation's future, you would expect a little bit more detail.
Detail and nuance, and maybe a larger majority as well, which is you know, one of the features, because I understand we're going to talk about the constitution as well. So if the UK had a codified constitution, then you could make it a requirement that say a 2/3 majority would be needed in order for such a referendum to pass. Because I think on big constitutional questions, a simple majority is just not good enough. Okay.
And also, if Ireland is any guide, it is possible to have consistent referenda. I mean, the feeling, and I think when it came to deciding upon abortion, I think the Irish government persisted with referenda until they got the answer they wanted. I apologise. I'm maybe doing a disservice to the politicians here, but because it's so easy to do a disservice to politicians because they invite it. But I think that's by and large is essentially what happened, either by design or by accident. The issues were tackled repeatedly, There was one referendum was not necessarily the be all and end all.
Yes.
People were given a chance to think about the answers they'd given, and then it was then covered again. So let's talk about the British Constitution. In your view, if you could summarize the British Constitution in a sentence, how would you do it?
So Britain has an uncodified constitution, which basically means there is not one set document, let's say, where all the functions of the state, the personnel, and the rights are outlined. So that doesn't exist, but it's a dispersed rule book. So the UK constitution is to be found in different sources. So you have Acts of Parliament, you have constitutional conventions, you have prerogative powers, and international treaties, and these are all sources of the UK constitution, but you don't have one document like in the United States of America or in Germany or in France, where basically the constitutional framework of the state is outlined. That doesn't exist in the UK, so it doesn't have a codified constitution, and it's only one of 3 states in the world without a codified constitution.
And the others are what? The Vatican?
The others are Israel and New Zealand.
New Zealand, yeah. But I gather these Israel and New Zealand also have safeguards built in of some kind, even though they don't have a...
Yes, I believe so, yes. Mm-hmm.
I suppose the other, the other challenge without having no written codified constitution, let's be clear, there is stuff in writing, but it's not codified in one place. You can't go to it and say, here is the constitution of the UK. You have to scramble about looking in different places. And then sometimes you have to go to the Supreme Court and ask them if they can come to a view on that, which is what the Scottish government did last year. But then you're asking lawyers to come to a view on the constitution where there is no codified constitution. That sounds like a big ask to me. But anyway, that's essentially what happened in that case. But it seems to be the other danger is that if you have no constraints, specific constraints, like you mentioned, having a significant majority for a constitutional change, it means the government of the day, vested with sufficient a majority, could then effectively amend what is thought to be the constitution to suit their own purposes.
Precisely, and this is one of the dangers that I see now with the Rwanda policy, which made me think that it really would be a good time to start talking about a codified constitution again, because I think we have a government at the moment with a significant majority, which I think is using these powers in ways which are not compliant with the rule of law, which it knows will probably end up in the courts and might be ruled to be incompatible with international human rights obligations. And I think there is a danger there of the government maybe acting excessively and breaching key fundamental rights just because it has that majority. So it doesn't have a constraint that could be provided by a codified constitution, because the judges in the UK don't have the power to strike down legislation. You see, if we had a codified constitution, judges in the UK could strike down legislation that doesn't comply with international human rights obligations. But because we don't have a codified constitution and because of the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, the judges can't do that.
We have a way of expressing the British Constitution on this program in one sentence, and it's this: the British Constitution is whatever the government of the day with a working majority says it is.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, an act of parliament is supreme. So any legislation passed in parliament is absolutely legally supreme. The only, as I said, there are some constraints, and that is that our judges are under an obligation to interpret laws in line with the rule of law, and now also in line with international human rights treaties. So there is some kind of break there, if you will. There's some kind of control. Yeah.
But
I think a codified constitution could offer a much bigger buffer against the government.
I mean, it is extraordinary. We did a survey a couple of 4 years ago, I guess, and we asked people across the UK about the constitution. And we asked them, for example, a very simple question like, of the following countries, which of these do you think has a written codified constitution? And the only country we got a majority for, 55%, agreed that this country did. It was the United States. Scarcely 30% knew that France had a written constitution.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, yeah, almost all countries in the world have constitutions.
Yeah.
But constitutions are often a product of revolutions as well, or of significant political events that then lead to a constitution. So
I mean, there's almost I would call a British disease here. I mean, for example, a lot of the people watching and listening to this program are advocates of Scottish independence, but the reality is that unlike almost every other independence movement in the world, which has generally placed the importance of independence or major constitutional change on our constitution. In other words, they've said, this is our constitution, and this is why we would like independence to behave this way. In other words, this is what we stand for, and this is what we will not stand for, so that everyone is clear. Not the way it's done in Scotland. It's very much a sort of, well, I'm sure everything will work out well. And I'm just feeling nowadays that's not satisfactory. I think you have to, if you're going to make a major constitutional change, you have to go to people with a clear contract and say, is this?
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages of a codified constitution is that you would have a lot more people who would actually know what their rights are. So, I mean, if you look at the United States, I mean, most Americans are not experts on the law, but everybody will be able to tell you that they have, a right to free speech under the First Amendment, or a right to bear arms under the Second Amendment, right? Or so everybody knows that. Why? Because the US Constitution is such a fundamental symbolic instrument that people just know about. And so I think more people would know what their rights are if we had a codified constitution. I believe that.
But Germany has a codified constitution.
Yes, it does, yeah.
Protects people's rights.
And yeah, I mean, again, one of the functions of a codified constitution is to protect rights, is to enshrine and codify human rights so that the government cannot abuse them. And, Germany is very much a product of that. I mean, the German constitution was drafted in 1949 after the end of the Second World War, with the aim of making sure that history never, ever repeats itself, so that no government in the future would be able to take away people's rights or to just breach them in such horrendous ways. So the German constitution prevents that from happening.
The average German is better protected in that sense than the average Brit.
I would say so, yes, because you have, there is a basic Bill of Rights in the German constitution. So yes, essentially the courts will protect those rights against the government, yes. Mm-hmm.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it's just extraordinary, absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
But you when I asked you the question about looking down the pike, as the Americans say, and trying to think out how things might be, and you said, well, I'd like to hope that the UK moved closer to Europe. But the reality is that both of the two major parties have said it's not for us. There was a decision taken. That decision must be respected, presumably in perpetuity. In other words, people aren't allowed to change their minds. A decision was taken. That decision has to be enacted. And I think what some people find confusing is that what is in place now isn't so much a decision to leave. It's the nature of the leave process, which seems to be of a very extreme kind. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of scope, it seems to me, for the opposition party to say, the main opposition party say, look, we're sticking with the decision, but we don't agree that we have to leave the single market, for example. Yeah. But they've done exactly the opposite, Daniela. They're saying, that's it, decision was taken, and that included the decision to leave the single market and all the rest of it, and we're pressing ahead with that. I just, from a Scottish perspective, that looks terribly confusing. Why would you do that?
It is, yeah, I think it is as well. I mean, that's not necessarily what people voted for, I think. I don't think that everybody knew that, voting to leave necessarily also meant leaving the single market. So, yeah, I'm trying to be optimistic, because I think that the only way forward, if you will, is a return to closer relationships with the EU. Because if we're looking at, everything we discussed tonight, like immigration, or big constitutional questions, or if we look at things like the environment, for example, global warming, I think can be tackled so much more efficiently as a unit, as one big common entity, if you will. And I think that's what the European Union provides, or if we look at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the position that the West should take against Russia, I think, we have a stronger voice if we all speak together in foreign policy as well. And I think all the major global problems of today can only be tackled in a big community, and that's why I think the future must be a return in a way to closer cooperation with the EU.
Some people have argued that one of the reasons that they voted against staying in the EU was because they felt it was overly bureaucratic, and that it was becoming more and more centralized, and they were concerned that the EU might want to raise an army, for example. A lot of concerns like that. I heard during the referendum, mainly not from people in Scotland, but mainly from people south of the border who maybe had a slightly anti-position right from the get-go and were looking for perhaps reasons. But it seems to me that there is some logic that says when you get an entity like the EU, there is a tendency to want to centralize. And I'm not saying this is peculiar in any way to the EU. Anytime I've ever seen a political group getting together, it always seems like a knee-jerk reaction is to say, let's centralize things.
Yeah.
We don't have enough control here. And whereas,
and I understand that criticism of the EU as being overly bureaucratic, or as, people not knowing what these commissioners in Brussels do, and them sort of getting big salaries, and people not really knowing what the EU does. So I think there's a lack of transparency there to a certain degree. So I understand that concern. But I have to say there have been many reforms made to the EU, though, as well, especially in the Lisbon Treaty. So, for example, the European Parliament now has equal powers to the Commission in terms of making laws, passing legislation, and that is a democratically elected body. So I think the EU has tried to address that democratic deficit and the concerns around transparency and bureaucracy to a certain degree as well. It's far from perfect, but I think it has already undertaken quite significant reforms to try and become a more democratic institution. So I think it's I do think that the EU is listening to the concerns of citizens.
People often say, well, essentially the EU is run off the back of the German economy. In other words, nobody else pays their way very much. But Germany, effectively, if Germany wasn't there, the EU just couldn't exist. And because where would the money come from, people say.
But I think we also have to kind of move away from this understanding of the EU just being an economic club. I think the EU is a lot more than that. It's also about forging closer cultural ties, social ties between people, educational ties, and it almost, if you look again, I can speak about Germany because that's the country I know best. For many Germans, being European is a default identity. Yeah. So they identify very closely with Europe and with the EU, because that is like a second identity to many Germans. So it's not just about economic ties. It's really about living in a united Europe and having that united European identity. And which I think is so important. Certainly, again, for Germans, it is, if you look at the surveys in Germany, I think there's something like 90% of the German population approves of the EU. And, there's no way that people would decide to leave the EU, because it's as I said, it's a second identity almost. So I think the EU, we have to move away from this idea of just seeing the EU as an economic club. I think it's much more than that.
No, I mention it because it's one of the criticisms that people have. But you're right. It's interesting you should say that 90% of Germans identify with the EU. I'm not sure.
Yes, the approval rating. I mean, I checked I think it was last year, and they did a major newspaper in Germany did a survey, and I think something like 90% of people would vote to remain in the EU. Yeah.
I know too that when I travel around, for me it's interesting. I mean, in Spain, for example, if you ask somebody where they're from, they will say Andalusia, and then you say, "But aren't you Spanish?" Well, yeah, of course I'm Spanish, but I'm Andalusian, and because the local identity, the state identity, is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but it's not really a political statement; it's a cultural statement.
Yes.
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 And then of course I'm part of Spain, and Spain is part of the EU. And I mean, anyone who's been to Spain and Portugal can see the results of the enormous investment by the EU in those areas, which I suspect would not have happened had there not been an EU, frankly. I mean, I know that's an economic issue again, but nonetheless, it's quite plain that the road system, for example, which is vastly superior to that in the UK in many respects, and the railways and all the rest of it, that there's been an enormous amount of
absolutely
economic funding,
and it's also about environmental protection. It's about, the EU has also delivered a lot, I think, for women, in terms of the pregnancy directives, equal pay, working time directives. So human rights. So as I said, the EU is much more than just an economic or a trading.
I would agree with that, and particularly from the perspective. I mean, one of the sensations I get traveling around is that a lot of the countries which are progressive have never been through a Thatcher period. They've never been through a sort of there is no such thing as society. Mm-hmm. Now I know she was misheard, I think she said, but she did say that she used those words in a church, that there's no such thing as society, and then she qualified it afterwards. But I think deep down she probably felt that was a value, i.e. that people shouldn't look to other people, they should be self-reliant, etc. And she laid great stress on that. And I think that's a moral imperative, and it does have an impact on the way people within a society view each other and view people from outside their society. I mean, I think you end up with the reverse of the situation in Germany if you go down that route of taking a very different moral stance about what constitutes the people round about you and how you should view them.
Yeah.
And it leads almost directly, I would suggest, to what we began this discussion with, which was that immigrants, you should be hostile to immigration. You should deplore people in boats. You shouldn't be sympathetic. You should say this is, your leader should stand behind a podium that says, "Stop the boats." Which I regard a moral affront, but that seems to be okay, and I think this is inevitably where you end up if you abandon any moral code, a very clear moral code about the way other people who are not you ought to be seen and regarded and treated.
Yeah, I think that's a very good analogy. I would agree with you. Yeah, and it's maybe also to do with geography, simply that Britain is an island. It's not part of mainland Europe. So maybe that contributes towards people in Britain maybe feeling a sense of distance between Britain and Europe.
I hear that argument a lot, but I think it's a cop-out, and I'll tell you why. If you look at what happened in Germany, Germany was the most civilized country in the world going into the 30s. But you can abuse the system and produce an outcome which is the very opposite of what people thought before. And that's got nothing to do with geography so much. It's got everything to do with deciding to go down a particular route. I mean, I think geography is too easy an excuse. Say, well, it's an island, therefore people can behave or misbehave the way they like, and don't have to worry too much about the rest of the world. I think you have to be concerned about what what happens round about you, it seems to me. And it's too easy to say, well, there's so many kilometres between the south of England and France, therefore, that's the French can do their own thing and it shouldn't impact us. But as we said earlier, that seems to be a function of how people how information is being delivered, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And I do look at other countries. I don't see the same vehemence about other people from other countries. I just don't see it. I wouldn't say it's altogether always welcoming, but I don't detect the same rather bitter view of others. I mean, is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, again, I can speak about Germany probably best. I mean, I can talk about other countries too, but I think in Germany, it's people don't want to repeat what happened in the past. And I think most Germans think we need to embrace immigrants and asylum seekers because, many of them are fleeing very desperate circumstances. And Germany is a very wealthy country that just has a moral obligation to take these people in as well. Of course, there's an economic calculation there as well, I would say, because the German population is aging, so many of these people are young and able-bodied, but I think there's kind of I think Germany, because of its past and because of the history and the Nazi regime, I think feels morally bound to help outsiders and to integrate them into German society, and maybe more so than any other country in Europe because of its past and because it doesn't ever want to go back to that. In terms of other European countries, I think there's more skepticism against immigrants. So if you look at Italy or France or maybe Greece, I think there is more hostility potentially, but I don't think that the hostility would reach as far as for there to be an active movement against the EU or against international human rights treaties. I don't think so. I think that most European countries do realize that they have a moral obligation to take these people in and to help where possible.
Do you think there's a connection? Some people have argued, we've had many historians on the show, and one of their arguments, it's not always consistent, but it is a fairly common theme, is that places like Germany and France and Italy and Spain developed their constitutional arrangements out of major turmoil and upset and revolution.
Yes.
And that never happened in the UK.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you see?
We didn't have a revolution in the 20th century or a major political or historical moment that prompted a codified constitution to be drafted. Whereas Germany, France, Italy, all the Eastern European countries, right? They had those moments. The fall of communism was pivotal. All these, former communist countries in Eastern Europe now have new constitutions. So constitutions are usually the result of big political changes and or historical changes.
It's almost like the reverse happened here, which is that the British Revolution, if there was such a thing, was actually an empire.
Yeah.
Britain got this empire. Where corporations and the government worked together to subdue large parts of the empire, and where the people here were fed a line that said, that the whole world was uncivilized until the British came and brought civilization. Now that's not an uncommon theme amongst countries. I mean, the conquistadors went essentially to help people.
Yeah, yeah.
Though Montezuma would have come to a different view, I suspect. And also the Mayans, but the fact of the matter is, and not including the Incas, of course, but the situation is that empires always say things like that. You're uncivilized. We've come here to help you.
Yeah.
And then the result usually consists of pillage and a large degree of rape and other obscenities as well. But that seems to be the nature of things. And maybe the Brexit thing was tied up in a sense of a loss of that status. In other words, we the sun never set on the British Empire was a common thing when I was told at school. And that was regarded as being laudable. But the interesting thing is that when people have something and they feel it's been taken away, sometimes their reaction is quite negative. You know, this was mine and somebody took it away. And if somebody comes along and says, the EU took it away.
It becomes quite convenient to then blame the EU for these losses, so-called losses, even though, you know, as I said before, I think we've gained a lot more from EU membership than lost. I think, you know, most people, I think, gained a lot more by being members of the EU than not being members of the EU, in terms of, you know, the ability to travel across the EU, to move to any other EU state, to trade freely, to set up a bank account or set up a business in another member state. I think these are all gains. These are not losses, in my opinion.
Yeah. And there's another argument that says, actually, Britain handled the loss of empire rather skillfully because it replaced it with Commonwealth. So it kept a whole bunch of countries into a trade agreement. You know, which is a big deal, if you know anything about history and slavery, to convince these people to continue a relationship. You could argue that's quite an achievement.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the other thing that I sometimes miss in the debate, in sort of the media debate on TV as well, is the fact that, I mean, Britain is a state that is very much a believer in international institutions, in international law. I mean, it's one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. It plays a leading role in terms of negotiating international human rights treaties. So I think, you know, being a member of an international community is very, very important to Britain and has always been very important. And I think the political rhetoric now just doesn't match with that in many ways, because, you know, Britain is a state that, not only is a member of the Commonwealth, but is also a key member of the United Nations, one of the top 5 permanent states in the UN Security Council, you know, and that's very significant.
So in the light of all of that, why do you think Brexit happened?
Oh God, that's a big question. I think there was a lot of misinformation in the media about what the EU is and what it does. And I think the benefits of the EU were not highlighted nearly enough. And I think the focus was exclusively on the EU as a trading bloc, as an economic club, but not on the EU as a cultural club, as a social club, as bringing human rights, as uniting people, as enabling young people to travel, to study abroad. I don't think that was emphasized at all in that whole debate. So I think the Remain campaign was also quite weak. And there was a lot of misinformation in the media against the EU.
But don't you think the EU could have done a lot more before Brexit came along to explain what it was about, to take a very different and less stoical view of people like Boris Johnson when he was a journalist in Brussels, running stories about the EU disapproves of straight bananas, or I can't remember what the story was, but anyway, he got paid thousands for misleading people about bananas. It always seemed to be the EU took a sort of rather passive position.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it was very complacent because it probably didn't expect that the UK would leave. I think, and that was the complacency of the European Union, and I think of the British government as well. I think they underestimated the anti-EU sentiment out there. So I agree the EU should have done a lot more to reach out to people and to educate people about the benefits of the EU. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't nearly enough done. Yeah.
I never quite understood that. It seemed to me that so much could have been done, because
they allowed
the rot to set in. And then once the rot set in, it became very hard to counter that, because it's easy for,
And I think it starts with educating young people about it. I mean, if it was up to me, I would have a subject on European or EU history on the curriculum in schools, in secondary schools. I think it should be taught as a subject so that young people learn about European history and the history of the EU as well, and why it was established. It starts at a very young age.
A lot of our audience are very interested in independence for Scotland. What's your view on that? Do you have a view on that?
Oh, it's a tricky one. I mean, I understand both arguments. I think I understand the argument for independence, and I think Scotland may be feeling disenfranchised and feeling that it's kind of being dragged into something that it doesn't want to be part of, and it voted to stay in the European Union, but was dragged out against its will. So I understand it from that point of view. But maybe I also understand the other side, which I think, the United Kingdom, I mean, Scotland and, England have been united since 1707, right? I mean, so it's, I don't know, there's so many cultural ties as well, right? Between, England and Scotland, and it's a very difficult one. It's a very difficult one for me to answer.
Yeah, it's interesting that in the 2014 referendum, it came down 55-45, which is pretty close. I mean, it's sorry, you're going to say, sorry, I interrupted.
No, and I mean, I think one of the good things that you do have in Scotland, though, is that you have a devolved parliament, so at least there is that. So Scotland has some authority over its own domestic affairs. So I think there is a degree of autonomy inbuilt in that already.
What did you think of the previous First Minister?
Well, I think she was very bold and very articulate, and I think very capable politician, and strongly pro-EU and pro-human rights. So I think I appreciate that.
Some people would say that she was very pro-women's rights.
Because of you mean the gender recognition bill?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's controversy around that, but it's not. I don't think it's anything too radical, because we already have a Gender Recognition Act in England as well. So I don't think that legislation is so controversial or so unimaginable. I think it's just she followed a trend that was already set up in European jurisprudence, the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, and she essentially followed what Westminster had done with the Gender Recognition Act.
Some people have said, do you think it's imaginable that she might end up in a United Nations role in New York, for example?
Absolutely. I can absolutely see Nicola Sturgeon as maybe even a future UN Secretary General, or having some high-ranking position in an international institution. I could very much imagine that. Yeah, maybe High Commissioner for Human Rights. I could see her do that too in Geneva. Yeah.
How do you think the British government would react?
Well, I think they have a degree of respect for her, don't they? Secretly, I mean, they probably know that.
Secretly, yeah.
I think secretly, they kind of have to admit that she's a pretty tough cookie. I think so. I don't think they would oppose it. No.
Well, judging by the celebrations that accompanied her stepping down, you would imagine that they rather did rate her as a formidable player.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine formidable players just leaving the scene.
Yeah.
It would be unheard of, frankly.
I mean, Angela Merkel is a good example. She has completely departed the scene. She doesn't want to be part of politics anymore, even though I think she could probably get all the top jobs in the world at the IMF or World Bank, but she doesn't want that anymore. She decided that she wants a private life. There are some politicians, but I think Nicola Sturgeon has so much more to give still.
That's interesting. Okay, well, our time is up, Daniela. I did say it would go fast. It goes very fast.
It goes very fast, yeah.
I'm just going to make a few concluding remarks. If you could stick around when we go off air, just for a couple of minutes, we'll have a quick chat. Well, there you are, folks. A big thank you to Daniela. I mean, as I said at the beginning, we aim to be educational, informative, and entertaining. And I think Daniela helped us achieve all of that and a bit more. And let me conclude by telling you that today we learn of the distress caused by Boris Johnson to human rights expert Sir James Fawcett. Apparently, it seems that Sir James was deeply upset that Johnson had abandoned moral principles. And Sir James Fawcett, he's Boris's grandfather. So it's a rare example of the acorn falling very far from the tree. Well, a big thank you to all of you out there for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this TNT show. We've also got, as you know, formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. Look out for next week's show, which features John Perkins, who describes himself as a reformed economic hitman. In other words, his contention is that the World Bank and the United States have contrived to render small countries into poverty, etc., etc. So it'll be interesting to hear what John has to say. As always, a reminder, please, to look out for my column in the Sunday National this weekend. I have a plethora of areas to look at, and I haven't quite decided which is going to be the best. You'll find, by the way, the column in the 7-day supplement. So, to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, take care of each other, and last but by no means least, look out for the crowdfunder. Thanks again. See you next week.
Thank you very much.